It's not that big of a deal.
I like Spider-Man. So, let's pretend it's still 2021 because I have some things to say about this movie. Yeah, people really did enjoy this one. And you know what? Nothing feels better than seeing humanity taking a well-deserved break to have fun and unite around enjoyment over the piece of media after the hellhole that we all went through over the past 2 years. Only if I could share that excitement too. I really went back and forth with myself about making this video. I never want to be that party pooper who goes, "Oh yeah, that thing you enjoy by the way, it sucks. Go dunk yourself into the lake or something." But what made me make the final decision was that people did not just praise the movie, but also referred to it as some sort of a masterpiece. And it's easy to do that since I feel like the term masterpiece today is being thrown around by people left and right. And, Your Honor, today I will be going against what seems like the rest of humanity by saying an enjoyable movie with a few masterful moments is not synonymous with a masterful film. And unfortunately for me, I will be using No Way Home as a centerpiece for this opinion. Before I begin, I want to preface this video by saying that my reaction to No Way Home is something that reminds me closely of Endgame, because when I saw Endgame in 2019, I of course enjoyed the movie, all the great moments in it, but at the same time, going out of the film, I felt like it was kind of not so great, especially compared to its predecessor. When everyone seemed to think that it was the greatest movie ever made and that it should have been number one on every chart and every list. Even though I agreed that it was a great send-off for Avengers, I did not think that it was a great film, period. But I was also scared that if I shared that opinion, I would probably get stabbed. But the thing about Endgame today is that most people will probably agree that it was a fun spectacle and it was a great time, but it was not as great of a film as it could have been. And that's the exact same feeling I get with No Way Home. The sort of isolation from the rest of the fandom or people who watched it for feeling this way about the movie. But I also think that just like with Endgame, as the time goes on and the experience aspect of it will die down, people will be more prone to listen and agree with the criticism of it, which is definitely existent with this one. But I'm definitely not going to wait around for another 3 years to say a critical word about the film, and I'm going to say it right about now, so there goes your disclaimer, I guess. Before I start criticizing the hell out of it, I am going to start on a better note and point out some things I like. Oh, and by the way, spoilers ahead. It was fun and exciting when I could overlook the inconsistent writing, and unfortunately this is probably the highest praise will go. And of course I loved seeing Andrew and Toby and the dynamic between the three bug boys. I liked the gesture of Andrew saving MJ, however predictable and on the nose it was. The ending was quite promising, and as far as the nostalgia baiting goes, all I can say is that I actually appreciate the movie for actually trying to incorporate the characters and the plot lines from the other movies into the plot and the narrative of the story, instead of, hey, look, Lando, and cut to him laughing and cut to black. But even though I appreciate it for trying, I still can't help noticing the obvious inconsistencies and plain stupidities that are caused by the amount of nostalgia the script tries to shoehorn into the story. And that being said, Your Honor, if you may, let's cut to the actual video. Hey, remember that one time that Peter tried to be a responsible young man and almost ended up killing dozens of innocent people on ferry while trying to take more responsibility than he could bear? I remember this scene.
Previously on Peter Screws the Pooch, I tell you to stay away from this.
Is everyone okay?
No thanks to you.
No, this is where you zip it. All right, the adult is talking. What if somebody had died tonight? Different story, right? Because that's on you.
Yeah, this scene where Tony literally shouts at Peter that sometimes taking too much responsibility even for moral reasons can be a heavily selfish act if it implies endangering lives of innocent people. Because if innocent people do suffer from your actions and your decisions, it no longer matters how selfless you try to be. Their suffering will be on you. Sometimes some risks are not worth taking, at least not alone. And that's how Peter gets to know that. until he doesn't. Yeah, scratch that. Let's let out 5 mentally unstable criminals to freedom and put at risk the entire city because, he said so. I don't know. Thank God Tony's dead. At the time, Peter was quite obviously shaken and traumatized by the experience at the ship. And even if that was not the case, you would think that at least Tony's words would cling to his small noggin for the rest of eternity. But nope, 20 movies later and Parker is still as naive as ever, except this time multiplied by 8.4 million or something. The Tony Stark had to spell this out for this guy, for him to go mature, learn, grow, go to space, fight with Thanos, and then come back and have a complete amnesia 20 movies later. And you might be thinking, well, that's why he's so conflicted when Aunt May tries to force him to take responsibility, saying, "It's not my responsibility." And that is not correct. The reason why he should not release the villains is not because they're not his responsibility, because by Spidey standards, they are, but because the risks might not be worth it. And even if he does end up releasing them, he has to be very careful about it. He could have kept them in cages and still helped them. These two are not mutually exclusive. I'm sad. I think it's a surprise to no one that the audience loves Doc Ock. They love Green Goblin. We know who they are and what they have been through. And for that reason, we're sympathetic towards them because we know that somehow all of these villains have become villainous somewhat unintentionally. And the movie uses that same bias and sympathy towards the characters to manipulate us into thinking that because we are sympathetic and because we know for a fact that these people have good in them, so does Tom Holland's Peter Parker. I meant to say Aunt May does. With your permission, I'm gonna refer to her as a plot from now on. When in reality, in the context of the movie, no one in the cast has a damn clue why these villains are the way they are. The only thing Peter knows for a fact is that his alternative selves all battled with each and every one of them, which eventually got them killed, and now are sad and psychotic. And for the love of God, I can't explain how on earth he would ever think that these people could ever be redeemed. Both Peter and Plot have no idea that at least half of these people have ever been good. And of what they do know of, they just rely on the sheer luck that Norman and Octavius do not turn out to be prone to compulsive lying along with their other obvious mental instabilities that led them to have criminal tendencies. For all Peter cares, all of them could be born as sociopathic, manipulative psychos. And we as an audience undoubtedly root for the antagonists because we are not stupid enough to understand that without our already existent knowledge of them, this plot would not even make sense. Or maybe we're not stupid, but we are just unbothered enough to ignore how stupid the plot is. But alas, it's downright insulting how this movie tries to use our knowledge and compassion for these characters against our own intelligence. It's like if in Endgame, Avengers went, "You know what? We feel bad for Thanos. He sounds so sad and grumpy all the time. Let's just time travel back and help him get into art school or something." And yeah, I can already feel hundreds of people lining up in the comments to pinpoint that that's just who Peter freaking Parker is. It's what he does. He is naive and young, and that's why he's so gullible and always messes up. But there's a difference between a script using a character trait to make a person more complex and a script overusing the said character trait to flatten the character by abusing and excusing characters' every single nonsense action by it. And if this was 2016, I would probably agree, but after Far From Home, that argument for this particular case could not be more wrong. We could all agree that Peter does act like a naive kid that causes him to do idiotic things, but we can also all agree that that does not make him an idiot who cannot for his life mature or read between the lines ever. And I'm bringing this up because in Far From Home, the exact lesson that Peter learns is, do not trust people you don't know. Because sometimes people we trust might turn out to be psychos, manipulators, megalomaniacs. Well, he was meant to learn this lesson, I guess, because evidently he hasn't. Differently from No Way Home, in Far From Home, Peter's trust in Beck's character makes complete sense since Mysterio literally spends like half a movie gaining it. Because even though the script is aware of Peter's naivety, it does not treat him like an idiot. Even then, Peter's inexperience and Mysterio's manipulative skills cause Parker to miscalculate in his trust, which my friends concludes in this scene.
What?
You are so dumb.
What?
I mean, you're smart as a whip. Just a
sucker. So now all your friends have to die.
easy to fool people when they're already fooling themselves. But for what it's worth, Peter, I really am sorry.
And here I am to believe that after that whole nightmare that this poor child went through, not only he does not have any trust issues or PTSD, but he is also ready and willing to trust literal confirmed murderers for no reason at all, like 5 days after being completely and utterly betrayed, deceived, and traumatized by Mysterio. If his actions in Far From Home make him naive, then his actions in No Way Home within the context of Far From Home make him out to be a complete halfwit, because at the end of the last movie, he is no longer a naive child, but an experienced dude whose gullibility has cost him a lot of trauma in the past. No Way Home keeps using his youth as an excuse for his nonsense behavior, even though he is basically an adult at this point, who has been through almost the exact experiences that he encounters in this movie, but somehow, due to amnesia, or maybe a genius writing that I do not have enough IQ to comprehend, still has not learned a thing. Oh, he's also been to space, battled with Thanos, is a physician, mathematician, chemist, engineer, but simultaneously he has not enough brain cells to decide against trapping the men who saw 14 million different outcomes of Infinity War and helped Avengers choose the only one that would end in their victory, and who is the only helpful and competent person on this earth when it comes to magic and who is willing to help, instead of letting out 5 deadly criminals to freedom. I'm sad. Okay, let's begin with an elephant in the room. If the elephant looks like an unapologetic goddess, a strong badass, and also a terribly written poor excuse of a plot device. In the past 2 movies, Aunt May was just there. Her connection with Peter was always evident, and more times than not, quite wholesome even. But she could barely even be considered to be a supporting character, let alone the most sensible one. May's purpose in the story was almost always centered around adding a familiar relatability factor to Peter Parker's everyday life. And it would make sense why MCU would decide to switch up May's and Ben's story arcs for obvious reasons, but it's as clear as day that MCU never actually made that decision. Well, not until Disney decided that they wanted to capitalize off of Spider-Verse's success, and now suddenly Aunt May goes from an occasional comic relief and a relatable embarrassing auntie to an entire moral and emotional backbone of Spider-Man, because plot. And this last mood switch up causes the movie to rely what's supposed to be the most gut-wrenching moment in the trilogy on the relationship and the character that was never correctly set up to have emotional impact of that magnitude, which in turn makes the emotional arc of the movie completely depend on the last-minute decision to screw Tony Stark and clumsily shove the quote to compensate for Aunt May's lack of emotional resonance with the audience. In the past movies, his Uncle Ben tells Peter, "With great power," I'm not gonna say the quote. It is done in a way that these words that initially flew over Peter's head were forever imprinted in his brain by the traumatic experience of losing his uncle by not following his advice. When Peter does not listen to his uncle, does not use his powers for greater good, does not take responsibility, it directly causes Uncle Ben's death. That is the reasoning behind Uncle Ben's death. He needs to make Peter see, listen, and prove his words to be true. And here's what bugs me with No Way Home's writing. It makes this movie to be a living, breathing contradiction of itself. You see, when Aunt May hints at this to Peter, Peter does not act like any other Spidey boy. No, this Peter is smart, this Peter listens to his auntie, this Peter does take responsibility, which directly causes Aunt May's death. Oh wait, if this Peter did not take responsibility and sent Willem Dafoe to hell, Aunt May would have survived. So what was the lesson to be learned here? Because in the past movies, while Uncle Ben died to prove his point, now Aunt May dies disproving it, which hilariously makes her death a direct contradiction of her own words, which in turn devalue the moral lesson that Peter has to learn here, since if Peter did act like a responsible buggy boy, she never would have died. Oh, and I'm not done talking about this quote, by the way. Is there a problem with hearing the quote used for a millionth time in these movies? To be honest, no, not really. These words are a huge part of Peter Parker's story, and without it, his character and writing is incomplete by all accounts. And that is exactly the problem. Every hero has to have a belief system, and that belief system in the story is created by the most crucial moments in their lives. For Peter Parker, in the past movies, that moment has always been Uncle Ben's death. Yes, a Spider-Bite gave birth to a Spider-Man, but Uncle Ben's words combined with his death were the ones that birthed a hero, in my opinion at least. But No Way Home does everything in its ability to underline the fact that Spider-Man still has yet to learn that lesson. Which creates a paradox, since the experience and the words that were meant to create him never quite got through his skull right until now, which throws off the entire course of his own character. Not only this does not make sense from the character writing perspective, but it completely ignores almost all of Peter's story arcs in the previous movies. Take a look at the first ever introductory scene of Spider-Man in MCU, and this entire emotional arc with Aunt May has no impact, since one of the first things Peter says in MCU is the exact lesson we were meant to believe he's meant to learn in like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I don't know, movies later.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen. They happen because of you.
So Peter has been living and breathing this saying since literally the moment we met him. But let's have a collective amnesia for the next 2.5 hours because plot! Even though me complaining about this quote might seem like a very nitpicky thing, but in my defense, this is the driving force of Spider-Man, and the biggest moral message behind his character. The same message this movie completely cheapens just because they really needed to squeeze in a badly written, sappy arc right before the third act of the film. This lesson is too big of a deal for Peter for it to be so comically overused and shoehorned into his ears at every given chance and every time for him to act like, oh, never thought of that way before. The actual problem arises when not just the audience, but Peter Parker himself has to not only hear, but learn this lesson for millionth time. I think this quote is a great way to showcase the biggest problem with this movie. Look, if No Way Home was the first one in the trilogy, this would make sense, but it isn't. In order to achieve set goals, the movie neglects its own predecessors and lessons which Peter learned in them, and almost presses the reset button on his character. And at the end of the day, you end up with a Spider-Man who across every MCU movie starts over learning the same set of morals or lessons, which in actuality have been his entire driving force from the get-go, over and over and over again. And by now you might be thinking, well, who cares if the writing in this movie is not great? It's fun and enjoyable, and I love it. And I'll say, Your Honor, exactly. Okay, you made this far, so let's get to the real point of this video.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Any size, can't you see? Just like Flash, look out!
And the actual point of this video is not me shaming anyone for liking, enjoying, or even loving this movie, because I can't get behind that. It's not my intention to shame anyone for enjoying it, because I am not crazy and I do understand the appeal. And I am definitely not going to pretend like I didn't cheer multiple times during it, but I am going to shame everyone who's going to confuse a few scenes worth of personal joy for a 2.5 hour long masterfulness. Was No Way Home an exciting spectacle? For many, obviously yes. Was it a painfully flawed movie? Absolutely. Does one excuse the other? Absolutely not, even by Marvel standards. Something tells me that in few years, most people won't remember No Way Home for its flawless plot or amazing dialogue, creativity, mind-blowing action scenes, or character development. In my opinion, it will most likely be remembered for scenes that people will be able to easily search up on YouTube and watch all of it under 15 minutes instead of going through 2 hours of plot full of holes, with nonsensical elements, almost non-existent stakes, some terrible jokes, underwhelming action, overused CGI. If you take away anything from this video, I don't want it to be that No Way Home is a complete trash or a terrible movie, but that we should stop interpreting just a few minutes of joy as a 2-hour-long greatness. Because if a movie's biggest purpose is to treat itself and serve as a high-budget context for a few nostalgic scenes written by people who do their absolute best job at being being the most mediocre is going to be a new staple for the films if they want to be baptized as masterpieces both by box office and the audience. We are in for experience, that's for sure.